It's catastrophic. It's completely incompatible with the way that F-Droid works. So it's more or less an extinction event for us.
It is an absolute honor to have Marc from F-Droid join me on Techlore Talks. Today, we talk about some super important things that impact the entire digital rights ecosystem that are being fought right now as we speak. We talk about F-Droid versus the Google Play Store and the key differences for what that means to you. We talk about Google's new policies and how this can impact F-Droid and other open source app stores on the market. We talk about how you can take action against Google Play service changes. We talk about the implications of centralized app distribution, and also some speculation on why Google might be even doing this in the first place. If you care about stepping up to big tech and doing the right thing and fighting for open source projects, this is the podcast for you. We recorded this on November 6th, so please keep that context in mind for when we're talking about current events.
Okay, I want to welcome Marc from F-Droid on the team. Do you want to say a few words about yourself and what you work on?
Hi, my name is Marc Prud'hommeaux. I've been a software developer for a very long time, 30 odd years. Been developing mobile applications in both the major ecosystems for the Apple iPhone and for Google Android devices ever since 2008. And I've worked in a variety of roles in a variety of apps, some very big name brand apps, some very small indie apps, and a lot of free and open source applications. And since last year, I've been a member of the board of directors for the F-Droid project, which is a free and open source mobile app distribution environment.
So how did you go from working, it sounds like more on the mainstream side of things, and then kind of pivoting over to this open source, still somewhat niche app store?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been a long journey. Earlier in my career, I was actually a server-side Java developer. And when, mobile phones first came out, both when the Android preview was released and then the iPhone App Store, first went into beta, very fascinated with the whole, idea of that. And I developed along with another developer an app called Stanza, which was the first electronic book reader for the iPhone. That wound up being very popular. So we formed sort of a startup around that. And we worked on that for a while. And yeah, that was really sort of my entrance into the environment. And ever since, I first started, I just loved the idea of being able to have this magical little rectangle that you could put software on. Anyone could develop software for, and anyone could distribute software through. And then as sort of my career progressed, I joined some larger companies, and then I went back to doing smaller projects, doing some consulting and contracting. I just came back again and again to how the current constrained distribution environment, both for the iPhone and the main distribution channel on Android devices, which is the Google Play Store, were very constraining and very stifling. And that was really what sort of sparked my interest in can there be another way? Like what is the potential avenue for having sort of a really free and open app development and distribution environment? And that was really how I sort of started getting interested in it. And then, over the years, I sort of developed some ideas around creating my own project, which would facilitate distribution, the development and distribution of these applications. And that's a project I'm still working on called the AppFair project. And one of those channels would be going through the F-Droid project. So I started collaborating with them, in sort of a lightweight manner at first, and then got more and more interested in the project until, I got to a point where, I felt like it would be beneficial to the project if they sort of had, the advantage of kind of a outside voice like mine, who is generally more familiar with industry and things like that, and less someone who came really from, the ground up, from the inside the free and open source software movement.
And just for timelines, when did you join the board?
The board, I believe I applied late last year, and then the election, I think, was in February of this year, February or March.
Got it. Okay. And then, so, it sounds like you almost have an iOS background at first. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, actually, I simultaneously started developing for both platforms, but it was really the iOS side that, kind of took off. And as a small development, group, it's really hard to have more than one platform you're supporting. So yeah, that was sort of how I kind of fell into the iOS side initially. But actually, I originally started developing for Android. It was just that that side did not advance as quickly as the iOS side.
Got it. And so if someone's listening to this right now and they're going, okay, maybe I use an iPhone, maybe I just use a regular Pixel that I buy from Google or a Samsung device, etc. How do you kind of break down this overall concept of app stores? Because uh, yeah, people seem to get it on desktop, but not fully on mobile devices yet. So how do you normally approach this conversation?
Yeah, so do you mean, what the App Store provides and what how the infrastructure works?
Just expectations over, I guess, software installation between
Yeah.
mobile and desktop.
Right, right. Yeah, so, historically, with desktop computers, there was no app store. You would download an application to your desktop and you would typically run it, sort of in the bad old days or good old days of computing. And you still do in a lot of environments. Um, they there have always been hazards around that. There has always been malware that can be distributed, viruses and things like that. But for the most part, it's worked great. There's a thriving desktop world. Mobile devices really, since they first started bundling with them these app stores, these app marketplaces. And they provide a lot of useful features. They provide, the ability to search among the entire catalog. They provide information about the app. You can, look at screenshots. You can often read reviews and things like that. And then you have a sort of an easy way to obtain the app, just by clicking a get button or something. And then if it is a paid app, then there's built-in infrastructure for being able to handle that. And then critically, it also supports being able to update existing applications. Applications always have bugs that need to be fixed. They very often have security defects that need to be addressed. They have new features and improvements that they want to roll out. And in the days of the desktop, you would sort of need to know, like, oh, I need to go and check to see if there's an update online. Or even before that, you would need to get a new CD with a new version of, say, Microsoft Word or something. And app stores really help remove the friction from that process. You can often configure them to just automatically install updates for you, which comes with its own set of perils, unfortunately. But that's a really low friction way to sort of always be up to date with your applications. And it's a really popular way to manage it. I don't believe it should be the only way, but on the iPhone, it is the only way to do it. And on Android, it is definitely the path of least resistance, either to use first-party app store, which is typically the Google Play Store, or maybe the Samsung App Store, or to use a free and open source alternative like F-Droid.
And then can you kind of give me the fundamental differences between something like F-Droid and the Google Play Store? If somebody hasn't heard of F-Droid before, how do you kind of break that down?
The major difference is that F-Droid is a non-commercial app store. You wouldn't even really call it a store because we don't sell anything. There's no registration. You don't have to sign up. You don't have to enter your email address. There's no personal information you provide. It's really just an app that you can use to browse vetted free and open source applications. If you sort of look at it in the simplest way, an app store is really just an app that installs apps. It lets you browse and search and update and things like that, but it's really just an app that installs other applications. And so F-Droid essentially takes out the commercial aspect of the App Store and puts in a requirement that all applications be free and open source, meaning that 100% of the source code needed to build that application is publicly available. And that's really the vetting that we provide, is that we offer trustworthiness, because the app can't sort of hide what it's doing. It can't hide any of its features or misfeatures. And so people really like to use F-Droid for a lot of different reasons. But one major reason is for concern over privacy and surveillance. You're pretty much guaranteed that none of these apps are embedding any of these sort of telemetry, spyware kind of libraries that are tracking what you're doing and then uploading this information to, third-party data brokers and things like that. You really know you can trust what you get from an app store like F-Droid. And the fact that we don't have any commercial incentive to, support things like in-app purchases, upselling, advertisements, and things like that means that, when you see that an app is advertising itself as, free, it really is free. It's not some marketing ploy to trick you into, upselling or, a free-to-play game where you have to buy gems or something like that.
Yeah, and one of the things that might come to mind, and this is, I know, still an ongoing debate because we hear it from Apple, we hear it from Google, is that they are keeping us safe and secure because they are going through and, any app developer, let's say they want to install malware on their audience's devices, they're going to upload a malicious version of the app, and naturally Apple and Google, if they're doing their job correctly, will catch that and prevent it from happening. So what kind of safety assurances can you offer through F-Droid, and how's your approach different from that?
Yeah, well, it is fundamentally different. On one hand, we have it a lot easier because we have a prerequisite in the F-Droid inclusion policies that it be 100% open source. It's pretty easy to spot when an app is trying to do something bad, either like undermining the security of your operating system or, acting as, scamware or something, like trying to intercept your banking credentials, or just, clandestinely surveilling you and uploading that information without your consent. It's a lot easier for us to identify those scenarios than it is for Apple and Google, which don't have any requirement that you reveal the source code of the applications you're uploading. And furthermore, even the developers who are, creating the applications that they submit to the Apple, App Store and the Google Play Store, they themselves don't always know everything that's going into their applications because very often they're using third-party libraries that purport to be providing, useful services. And really what it's doing is it's, gathering telemetry on the user, uploading it to this, third-party service so that they can profit from it either immediately or down the road when they can resell your data. So we really have it a lot easier than they do in order to, provide, these sort of security assurances, these security guarantees. But furthermore, we're not conflicted in what we identify as being malware versus not malware. There are plenty of people that identify any form of advertising, any form of telemetry as a sort of malware. But obviously, these are the things that these first-party platform providers themselves profit from. Or, say in-app purchases where you have this sort of casino mentality where, you pay to win, you pay to get, gems, these gotcha games and things like that. They're all skimming a cut off of it. So they are disincentivized from even considering that that might be a form of malware, whereas we don't have that commercial, conflict of interest. And so we can just across the board say that these things are not suitable for our particular marketplace.
I appreciate how you bring up this inconsistency of the term malware. I was in Cyprus just a couple weeks ago at the Ad Filtering Dev Summit, where you have some engineers, from Brave, DuckDuckGo, Firefox, etc., and they're building really cool stuff. And then one of the researchers talked about these insane workarounds that Meta and other social media apps use to pretty much track users across different applications. And it uses the Facebook Pixel. So it's so interesting because I don't think most people would consider the Facebook app on their phone malware because they're like, well, this is a useful tool. But just because something's a useful tool doesn't mean it doesn't function in a way that's quite exploitive to the user. And I'm just wanted to kind of shout that out as a good talking point that you brought up.
Absolutely. I mean, that is a fundamental concern. These services that they provide, these applications, and like in the example of Facebook, this social network that lets you connect with the world, both your friends and local community, as well as broader interest groups. Those are really valuable, and it's pretty amazing that it's provided to you for free in the sense that you do not need to pay any cash directly to them. But obviously that is being paid for somehow. How is that being paid for? It is gathering as much information in whatever way as possible on you so that they can build a profile and advertise to you, have targeted advertisements. I mean, that's really the one and only reason why they're able to make these, and I will say amazing services, be able to be offered at, zero cost to people. And that is a fundamental conflict that, the creators of these applications have, and it's a fundamental dilemma for anyone who wants to provide a, app store and app distribution service that authentically works in support of the user's interests and not in the interests of the individuals or corporations who are developing and creating the application.
Yeah, it's a good stance to take. And one little minor question I had, you brought up how some developers don't even know that they are including third-party libraries that include malicious things in them. And I've heard this quite a lot, actually. Do you have a ballpark educated guess on what percentage that is? Like, do you think it's 50-50? Do you think most developers don't know? Just kind of prying a little bit there.
Well, so whether or not they're fully aware of every dependency that they have, I'd say the larger the application gets, the less likely they are to really understand every nook and cranny and corner of it. Anyone, I would say any developer who's been around for a while who is including any, third-party, telemetry, analytics gathering utility probably has a pretty good sense that they are essentially selling out their users, private and intimate information, subject to however much the app itself is able to gather, which is contingent on how many, entitlements and permissions has been granted. So I would say, most developers can't really, with a straight face, say that they don't know what they are including. But they could have plausible deniability in the sense that if something gets eventually, these frameworks sometimes get marked as malware by the first-party app store owners, by the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store, and then they're able to identify those applications that use it. Typically what they'll then do is they'll warn the application developer that they need to have a new version that removes it. But I would say most developers are at least tangentially aware of when they are, including something that could, at least in theory, be acting against the interests of their users.
Got it. And then the last question I have before we dive into more of the situation going on with Google. Why does F-Droid only exist on Android? I know it's maybe an obvious question for a lot of our audience members, but if anybody's new, why is there currently no F-Droid for iOS, and do you think that could change in the future?
Yeah, so it really goes back to just sort of the beginnings of both of these ecosystems. From the very beginning, the iPhone was designed to be sort of a kind of a lockdown, walled garden environment. It was only ever really designed to have, a single first-party application distribution mechanism, which is the Apple App Store. In contrast, from the very beginning of Android, it runs on the Linux kernel. It comes from a, more or less open source foundation, the Android open source project. And from the very beginning, they had, APIs that allow anyone to build an application distribution environment. Because the Google Play Store was not there from day one. They wanted independent carriers to be able to develop their own software and distribute, applications in whatever way they see fit. And it has been wildly, successful. There are dozens of app stores available, especially in China. There's at least half a dozen major ones with millions of users. And on other Android environments, there's Samsung, as I mentioned. Amazon had one up until recently. There's the Epic Games store and things like that. So it's really baked pretty deeply into Android that they have the ability to have anyone create this application distribution mechanism, because those APIs are just fundamental part of the operating system.
Got it. And so do you want to maybe, it's a good segue into how that might be changing and what Google has announced their plans are. And so I'd love to kind of hear from you, maybe a summary of what's happening for people who aren't in the loop. Just kind of start that conversation.
Yeah. So to talk about that, I'll lead up to it a little bit by talking about what we term side loading. So we've been talking about application stores and apps that install other apps. There's also a way of just directly installing applications on your device. You can just download a application, usually ends with the suffix APK, from any website, and then it'll pop up a little screen and say, do you want to trust this developer? And you say okay, and then it installs that app and runs it. That's actually how you install F-Droid. You go to the F-Droid website and you click on this and you install it, and it starts up. And then once you've trusted that developer, in the sense that you trust the signing certificate that the developer has used to sign that application, then you will be able to automatically install updates from that same developer without needing to retrust them. And similarly, if that signature changes, then the system will warn you as like, this was not signed by the same person. So it's a way of establishing direct sort of consumer to developer trust without necessarily relying on any middleman, any app store, in between. And so that's also a fundamental part of Android. It's been around, since the beginning. And, there are thousands of, not tens of thousands of applications, popular applications that are distributed that way, including the Apple Music application for Android. They have their own dedicated page to say, this is how you can sideload our application. They have step-by-step instructions for, no, it's been around for a long time. I think it's, Google Play Store is not available in all markets, and so I think it's a mechanism for them to provide it, largely to these markets. So it's been around forever, and it's been very hands-off. None of this goes through, Google in any way. And so that leads up to a couple of months ago in August, Google, sort of out of the blue, announced they are starting what's called the Developer Registration Program. And what this program does is it will require all developers everywhere in the world to register centrally with Google in order to be able to distribute these applications that they make. So that means that you need to, no matter what country you're in, no matter what jurisdiction, you need to go to Google, register with your personal information, provide government identification, pay them a fee, agree to terms and conditions, and then upload evidence of your signing key. So essentially, you don't need to upload your private key itself, but you need to sign a sort of mini app that they send you to prove that you are the person who is able to sign applications. And if you don't do this, then starting next year, Android itself, all Android devices, all Android certified devices, will block applications that have not been verified by Google.
And so, do you mind, this, is this kind of bad? Is this really bad? What are kind of your stances on this kind of proposal?
I mean, it's catastrophic, especially for F-Droid. I mean, it's completely incompatible with the way that F-Droid works, because we don't require that our developers will be registering with Google, and many have already said straight up they're not going to do it. So it's more or less an extinction event for us, which is one of the reasons why we are so full-throated in our opposition to it. So yeah, it's terrible for us. It's terrible for anyone who just wants to be able to develop an app and share it directly with their friends or their family or their community or their church group or anything like that. It all of a sudden turns it, takes it from a thing where an individual hobbyist can just spend a weekend developing this neat and useful application, to something where you need to go through all of these steps. You need to provide all this personal, intimate information that you might not be comfortable with sharing with Google. And you need to register with them all of the identifiers for every application you ever intend to distribute, which might not be something that you're interested in sharing with them. So it's a massive change. It completely changes the openness of the platform from what has always been for the past 18 years.
Yeah, and what are some of the reasons that Google is using to justify this decision? And then how do you agree or disagree with some of those kind of decisions that they're making?
Yeah, so you can look on their webpage at the Developer Registration Program. They have a recent blog entry and a YouTube video, Developers Roundtable, that pretty much goes over their rationale, both about how they're going to be implementing it and why. The one and only reason that they have stated is to prevent repeat malware offenders from being able to operate. The scenario, somewhat far-fetched scenario that they lay out, is the case where some group develops some sort of malware or scam app. Like I cited, maybe an app that pretends to be your bank and intercepts your credentials and then uses it to take all your money or something. It won't prevent that, because obviously they can just register, like anyone else, with falsified credentials or whatever, and develop the app. What it will prevent is if that app winds up getting identified and zapped by the Google Play Protect services, which is a complete separate service that runs on device, scans for malware, and then when it identifies it, either warns the user or removes it altogether, depending on the severity. It will prevent the developers who come up with an app like that from simply being able to turn around and redistribute the same application with a brand new signing key that they didn't have to register anywhere. So that's really the very narrow hypothetical malware distribution scenario that this particular registration program would potentially be able to mitigate.
And why is that catastrophic for F-Droid? Because you said it would be a disaster. So how does this impact you guys?
Well, so as I mentioned, so F-Droid has a different sort of couple of different modes of operating. Historically, what would happen would be, a developer creates a free and open source application. They host the source code somewhere, maybe on, GitHub or GitLab or Codeberg, or just on their website. And then they submit to F-Droid essentially a request for inclusion. And then we go through and we say, okay, is this really open source? Is this is this a kind of application that we want to have on the platform? And then historically, we would just download that and we would build it and we would sign it with our own signing key and distribute it. Trying to move away from that to a much more secure and modern approach, which is called reproducible builds, which is that the developer themselves can build their application, essentially publishing their own APK that someone could download either directly from your website or through a service like F-Droid. And then what we do is we validate that by essentially just rebuilding that application and comparing the two and making sure that they match identically. And what that enables is it enables the developer to use their own signing key to distribute that application, which is what really permits the trust relationship to be from the user directly with the developer and not necessarily just trusting the intermediary app store. And we cannot require that our developers register with Google. There's no mechanism for us to even check that or verify that. So, if this were to go into effect today, not only would the F-Droid app itself stop launching, but all of the apps that we distribute through F-Droid would also just, stop launching and would go dark overnight. And that's really the fundamental reason that it just doesn't work with the F-Droid model.
Yeah, so I guess what would, and maybe I'm missing something, but with like a web-based F-Droid where you somehow were able to confirm that each developer went through Google's verification successfully, and then you'd have to, there would be no like automatic updates. You'd have to do it one by one. Is that maybe the best you could even do in that situation? Best case scenario?
In theory, I mean, if we were not philosophically opposed to this program as well, in theory, we might be able to do something like that where we would mandate that developers do this. But we're not going to do that.
But still,
like, we don't.
Yeah, that's still a bad situation.
Yeah.
And the philosophy is definitely something that I think is important that you guys are sticking to. I'm just kind of seeing what even a best case scenario would look like for someone who maybe wanted to even, like if someone didn't have a philosophical issue with this and they were like, I'll still try to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we're not necessarily prevent our developers from doing this as well. Like we essentially, it's up to the developer whether or not they sign on to it. we recommend against it for right now, at least. But we, nothing stops developers from doing it, in which case these would just work. It's just we have no way of knowing whether or not, the applications that we distribute are registered or not with Google.
Got it. And then so how does this impact other app stores? Is it the same situation for all other app stores?
Yeah, essentially, which is why we're a little surprised that there's not been more outcry from other commercial app stores, because, this, as well as being sort of concerning from privacy reasons and raising barriers of entry. Obviously, there's a fee that they charge for doing this and things like that. But also, for a commercial competitor to the Play Store, it ought to be extremely unsettling because all of a sudden you need to register with your direct competitor. You need to have all your app developers register with their direct competitor in order to be able to distribute through your own app store. That really, I think that aspect of it maybe has not completely sunk in with the broader industry about this, because it ought to be seen as being sort of blatantly competitive. It's a little bit like if I have a car dealership and I want to sell, my Ford model, I need to require that everyone first go get approval from Chevrolet in order to be allowed to do it. There's no real precedent for anything like this, ever happening before in my experience in software.
Yeah, and I always dislike asking this question, but it's something I do have to ask because I don't know. I care. I'm sure a lot of our audience cares, but let's say someone's just using an iPhone. They just use the Google Play Store. Let's just call them a typical regular user. Why should they care about this?
Yeah, well, we think that people in general should care about their privacy. People should be more aware of what these applications are doing, how these applications, impact, the information that is being collected from you, often clandestinely. And in order to provide a check on that, we think it's essential that there be a open ecosystem, that it should not be monopolized by a single player, that things should not be gatekept by one single global entity. To give one concrete example of, an actual, useful service that F-Droid has provided is that there was, a while ago, there was a suite of applications, very popular, called Simple Mobile Tools on Android. And they provided, pretty much, run-of-the-mill applications. They have a calendar, they have, a camera app, they have, scheduling applications, an email client, sort of a whole mini suite that you could use to replace, the existing, pre-installed, sometimes, crapware that comes with your phone with some nice, clean, simple open source applications. That was distributed because they were free and open source on both the Google Play Store and on F-Droid. And then what happens, as has so often happened with a lot of applications, both in the iOS and in the Android ecosystem, is that this app developer wound up getting acquired by a company, and all of their apps getting acquired. And then almost immediately, these apps wound up getting, their source code got closed down. They started injecting advertisements, everywhere. They started adding in-app purchases that take away features and put them behind paywalls. They started adding, telemetry and surveillance and things like that. And so this implied contract that you had with this app developer, that just vanished overnight, non-consensually. And since almost everyone has these automatic updates turned on, the next day, these apps that were formerly ones that you trusted suddenly became something that you could not trust the next day. However, on the F-Droid side, what happened is because the source code before it had gotten acquired was still free and open source, an organization called Fossify just took them, forked them, and then started releasing them, continuing to be these sort of honest, simple, authentic, free tools, first through F-Droid and then again through the Play Store. And the identification and the calling out of that was, really something until F-Droid removed those applications from the original applications from our App Store because they no longer complied with the open source requirement, as well as breaking a lot of other, inclusion policy rules. A lot of users maybe never would have been aware of what had happened and how it had happened. But instead, a lot of people who were like, why did these tools suddenly become crummy overnight? A lot of forums are saying, oh, here's how you get the real ones back. You go and you get this open source one. If something like F-Droid didn't exist, that broader service might not have ever been made available to the rest of the world, and even had a knock-on effect of being available through the Play Store. So that's sort of one real and concrete example of a service that having a competitive marketplace like F-Droid has provided for the community.
Yeah, it's quite frustrating. I mean, there's two things that I see happen all the time. One, these massive companies steal open source code, oftentimes not even attributing that code. I mean, a lot of people to this day, and I know this is a totally apolitical thing that I'm saying. It's the one that came to mind. But Truth Social was a complete Mastodon clone. They totally stole the Mastodon code. There was references to the Mastodon code. They kind of sloppily stole it. Now they do reference it. I actually went to the website yesterday to confirm that. And now they say, oh, open source on the bottom, and it links to that. But all these big tech companies use open source code for different things, and it's very frustrating. So that's issue one. But issue two is that even if you use these platforms, people go, well, I've never used Linux, so why do I care? But if the only two options that existed were macOS and Windows, they might look very different if Linux wasn't there as that alternative. And I feel like you guys are in a very similar boat, that without you checking the Play Store could look very different for people. So yeah, just a bit of a rant on my end.
But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, even if people are not interested in using F-Droid, directly, we do have a broader check on the ecosystem, especially as pertains to keeping open source players honest. If something turns bad, if the rug gets pulled, as it so often does, then we're sort of there to help provide alternatives and provide sort of a guaranteed safe place that will never be possible in. Yeah.
So one thing that I did want to also ask about this is tied to the Google Play services, as far as I'm aware. So if you're just using a regular Android device, then this is something that's going to impact you. However, I got a bajillion comments about this because I've been doing coverage about this F-Droid stuff. People are like, well, this is why I'm using Lineage OS, which doesn't come with Google Play services. And maybe it uses microG. I've seen people using Graphene who go, well, I'm using Sandbox Play services, or I'm not using any at all. So why should these people still care about what's going on? Because there seems to be this idea that, oh, I'm not using Google Play services, so I'm unaffected by this.
Yeah, right. So, this does only affect what they call Android certified devices, which is, devices that are essentially approved by Google. The requirements for that are that you use, Google Play services, that you have the Google Play Store at least available as an option on your device. But as a benefit, you get to use Google Mobile Services, which provides, it makes it easier for people to use. So outside of China, these Android certified devices are well over 95% of all installed devices. I mean, this is really like the entire universe of Android devices in the world outside of China. The rest are non-Android certified devices. They might be custom ROMs, they might be Lineage OS, they might be Graphene, they might be Calyx, they could be PinePhone. There's quite a wide variety and thriving ecosystem that we fully support. But these are really 1 to 2% of all users. You're not going to really be installing this on your grandmother's phone, unless you have a really interesting grandmother. And they are right. And I do see a lot of, kind of crowing from that crowd saying like, yeah, see, this is why I chose this. And we fully support them. And F-Droid is often the primary, app distribution environment for those devices. But, do we really want to sacrifice 95% of, the Android users out there to be subject to this? I think I think it's a little bit narrow-sighted to say, oh, your solution is just to install Lineage. That's not a solution for, billions of people in the world.
Yeah, and I think something I was thinking about as well, and maybe I don't know if this is fully true, so you're a perfect person to ask here. My understanding, so of course this is really only directly going after developers. This isn't directly going after users at all. And so what's the downstream effect of the developers who don't want to continue developing apps away from the Play Store? Like that still will impact those custom ROMs if the developers developing those open source apps they're using aren't able to will they still develop for that small subset of users? That's
Yeah,
kind
I
of my
mean,
question.
yeah, I mean, I think it remains to be seen. We have seen a number of developers who, I've already said, I'm never signing up for this, and I'll probably just stop developing altogether and, go do something else, woodworking or something. I don't know if that is gonna, be a very widespread protest. But I think the world is a worse place for it because those are often the developers who have the most interesting application ideas, applications that might not fit perfectly well with the Google Play Store's own, inclusion policies, that might only be able to be distributed, through direct download. Sometimes very niche apps, sometimes, apps that they just don't think have commercial viability or not interested in the Play Store. Um, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who continue to develop them and are happy to drastically reduce the number of people who are able to install them. But what that number is, I think only time will tell.
Yeah, not something we want to leave up to chance. Um, so, if someone's hearing this, what are the next steps here? Like, what are the timelines that Google has proposed? What can people do that is actionable, that can make a real difference, whether or not they even use F-Droid right now? What are you kind of sharing with people?
Yeah, so there's a website that I worked with people on, called keepandroidopen.org, and that essentially lists, the call to actions that, we think are the most viable. This is not a direct F-Droid project. This is actually a project that I just sort of undertook on my own, and then it turned into, there's about 20 contributors now. They translated it into 5 different languages. Essentially, the calls to action there are based on 3 target audience groups. It's consumers, developers, and the state regulators, people who are the governing bodies around these things. In terms of consumers, really the most effective thing that you can do is contact your local jurisdiction's regulators and make them aware of your objection to it, why you think that it is problematic. This will be most effective in areas that have a strong, regulatory environment, especially the European Union. This particular act is in direct contravention of the requirements imposed by the Digital Markets Act, and I think regulators need to be made aware of that. Also, plenty of other countries are looking into app store monopolies and regulation around there, namely Brazil, Japan, the United Kingdom, South Korea are some of the more advanced ones around that, and then other ones are sort of following suit, Australia. But yeah, reaching out directly to regulators, making your own individual voice heard, I think that's really the most powerful thing that consumers can do right now. Other options are, looking into alternative ecosystems, not just installing F-Droid, which, by the way, I think everyone should do. It's just great to have as, a backup and a place that you can really go to really trust the applications you get. But also looking into different ecosystem options for, like custom ROMs or installing Lineage OS. You might stumble upon a really, interesting, setup for yourself that works really well for you. But yeah, the most effective thing that a consumer can do really is to try to make your voice heard. From developers, the most effective thing you can do right now is do nothing. Do not sign up for this. It's in early access right now, but they're going to be opening up developer registration early next year. Do not add your name to this list. Do not upload your information. Do not pay them money for the privilege, which is sort
How
of
much
the
money is
ultimate.
it, by the way?
It's not much. I think they have it set right now at $25. But it's just like,
Still,
come
it's
on.
kind of crazy.
I mean,
Yeah.
you're really adding insult to injury. Don't do any of it. Just opt out. there'll always be time later if it comes down to it on the day, it's going to come into effect. You can always do it later, but don't do it now.
Is that annual or is that a one-time?
I believe it is one time, but
Okay.
I don't know if that is set in stone yet. It's all their documentation is sort of like subject to change and things
Got
like
it.
that. Same with the terms and conditions. One of the really alarming things about it is that they say, oh, you just have to sign their terms and conditions. Of course, they're 100 pages long and they have all sorts of clauses in them, especially some really alarming stuff. But the thing is that these are always changing, coming from developing for these commercial app stores, the Apple App Store and the Play Store. Every month or so you get these updates, and if you don't click OK, your apps get nuked. I mean, you're pulled from the store. So everyone is just sort of conditioned in this Pavlovian way to be like, oh, terms and conditions have updated, click OK. And if those terms and conditions contain things like, thou shalt not compete with, Google, with YouTube services, or thou shalt not compete with Apple Music, well, all of a sudden you've just clicked yourself out of business. So I mean, that's really the alarming thing about these terms and conditions, is that it's not a one-time thing, but it's a rolling thing that they can update over time to say anything that they want. So yeah, so for developers, summary is don't sign up for it. It's just a bad idea. And tell your other developer friends not to sign up for it. And then third is for the state themselves, for governments and regulators. Look really closely at this, considering how it affects your own country's digital sovereignty, right? Like you are essentially ceding the rights of your developers and your businesses and your governments to be able to speak directly to your consumers through technology. I really regard software development and app development as a form of speech. You're not just providing a tool, you're providing a mode of expression. And just like the printing press has been a force for advancing the Enlightenment over centuries, app development is a way of facilitating people to communicate with their environment. And anytime you are allowing essentially a distant entity, especially a for-profit entity that might be competing with their own businesses, to have a single global kill switch for this, to have a single point of gatekeeping, you're giving up a lot for your businesses, for your defense. To cite one particular example, it was back in 2021. Back when there was a parliamentary election in Russia and Alexei Navalny was running against Vladimir Putin. He had a election app that was available on both the Play Store and the App Store. And shortly before the election, the Kremlin essentially strong-armed both Google and Apple to pull that app from their App Store. And that app disappeared. The results of the election were probably a foregone conclusion anyway, but obviously, the current regime won. Alexei Navalny is now dead. Russia has invaded Ukraine and is on the border of the rest of Europe. So these are not like sort of hypothetical out there ideas, but having a single centralized control to all app distribution focused in two companies that are located 10 miles away from each other, it just seems like it ought to be extremely alarming to every government out there.
And every person. I mean, yeah, when you put it very well there, I think, to really drill the message home. So I guess an initial question here, why? Yes, Google's saying malware, they're saying security. It's easy to point at it, and this is what I've been doing, and just say, oh, it's for more control over the platform. Is that kind of the most that you're able to really attribute this to? Do you think there's any other motives behind it? I know it's all speculative. You don't know, but do you have any ideas on maybe like what they're actually trying to accomplish from this?
Yeah, I mean, it would be speculation. There's obviously a lot of speculation floating around. Most of it is mostly unsupported. I would say I think it's fair to say it's for control, right? They've seen that Apple gets away with this, that Apple gets away with it even in areas where it's blatantly illegal, like in the European Union under the Digital Markets Act. They see that they've been, flouting that with impunity, and they think that now is probably the time where they can get away with it. We're obviously in the United States in a pretty light touch regulatory environment, and so there's not going to be, any serious investigations on the part of the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Consumer Affairs, the Justice Department. That's just not going to be happening. And so, I think they're thinking the time is now to do it. And not only because of legislation, that following the Digital Markets Act in these other countries, but also because of, new requirements as a result of the settlement with Epic Games that is going to mandate that they, be able to distribute third-party app marketplaces from their own Google Play Store. They want to be able to lock down as much as possible the potential kinds of applications that are going to get distributed through there. And this is the obvious, route to being able to do it.
It's funny you brought up Epic Games right now. I'll take random bullet points as you say certain things. And my next one that I wanted to ask about, because I just have to quickly type things out. Epic Games, LOL, question mark. And the reason why, I just think it's almost, I can't find a better word right now other than unhinged, of Google to be kind of taking these L's against Epic over this exact thing. And Google is now simultaneously doing something that's in some ways 10x more extreme than they ever did against Epic. So, well, yeah, it's just, I don't know if that's a question. I just find it a bit crazy.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely a crazy time, with the outcome of the lawsuits, and how different it is between, the lawsuit between Epic and Google and the one between Epic and Apple, where the outcomes were so wildly divergent. I'm sure Google has some, very bitter feelings about that, and feel like, why did we get, kind of shafted on this and Apple didn't. But, that was the outcome that happened and is going to be sticking with us for a long time. But, they had to come to some sort of settlement, right? Like, Epic, totally won out in the debate about, distribution. And yeah, so I think they're doing this to sort of get in front of it, lock things down as much as they can get away with, which from a commercial, they're not being irrational. They are a profit-seeking entity, and they're looking to protect their profits as much as possible. I don't see it as like, there's no real like humanity involved with it. It's just that they're trying to do what corporations do.
Yeah, so, through this, I'm sure it's very stressful for you all at F-Droid and a lot of the people that you're close with. Who else have you kind of seen step up? And, have there been any surprises behind the scenes of like people that you think are doing really good work right now?
Yeah, so both as F-Droid, we obviously communicate with the community, civil society groups, government regulators, and things like that. Also on the keepandroidopen.org site, we are putting up an open letter for people to sign. And we have, quite a lot of signatories that have committed to the open letter, essentially asking Google to just reverse this policy and not do it. I mean, opposition has been almost universal, both among, the individual groups that we've encountered, among, consumers who are sort of cognizant of the technologies around there, and developers. I mean, we really haven't seen anyone speaking up in support of this policy that has at least communicated through any forum whatsoever, to us. I was actually a little bit surprised. I figured there would be at least someone, some industry group or something who was like, no, we actually fully support this. We make banking apps or something, and we think it'll be great and prevent scams and stuff. There's been dead silence. It's really only been Google themselves that has been trying to defend this, and not very effectively, in my view.
Yeah, so, what is still kind of, what still drives you, day to day? Given, there is a lot of uncertainty perhaps in the next year or two. So is there anything that still excites you about this crisis, maybe outside of this crisis? Just kind of how are you grappling with this personally?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of excitement is that there's a lot more awareness than there had been, even a month or two ago about this. People who had not really even thought about ways of installing applications, through the non-first party default, promoted app stores, are suddenly aware of, not just F-Droid, but of, being able to just get apps directly. It's really popular for things, especially things like ad blocking, which, obviously is pretty reduced in its presence in commercial app stores. So there's sort of been a surge of excitement, around F-Droid and alternative app marketplaces. It's kind of like what they call the Streisand effect, right? It was only through, coming out and attacking the project that, we started getting a lot of attention. So that's exciting. And the other exciting thing, I think, is that there's been, a little more attention on the Apple side of things. As sort of a separate thing, separate from F-Droid, I've, over the past year or so, have been consulting with various, regulatory groups in Europe around the Digital Markets Act and how it should apply to Apple. And they are saying, like, well, it really isn't consistently applied between Google and Apple, and it ought not be because they're both designated gatekeepers. So, I hope that this will maybe open the opportunity for making a case that the Apple ecosystem should be opened up a little bit more, that there should be an F-Droid for Apple, and it should not just be constrained to, one of the duopoly of mobile platforms out there.
Yeah, and where do you see this potentially going? Like, do you think the fight's lost? Do you think it's won? What's kind of next? And assuming, worst case scenarios, so I've seen this. I know this is a lot of questions, so I'll do my best. I've seen a lot of people talk about how this is actually a result of having only two operating systems. Kind of how I mentioned earlier, Linux just existing probably has a lot of indirect influence on the other ones. But there is no real Linux phone. I know there's PinePhone. I know there's still Librem 5. I know Postmarket OS. I know these things exist, but you already talked about the small percentage of these like alternative Android users. That's, tiny, 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 tiny. So do you think that's really something that needs to happen for this to be fully prevented in the future, for there to be a full ecosystem alternative? I don't know if that's a cohesive question, but I'll just let you.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, the duopoly is essentially monopoly right now. You have two different corporate players located, 10 miles from each other with essentially identical policies. And, we're seeing a shrinking in the difference between these two platforms. And I think it is really, really harmful. There is no equivalent to, Linux as a counterweight to the Windows and Mac OS, desktop world. And, once upon a time, this was a thriving ecosystem. You had Nokia, you had Symbian, you had Palm OS and Windows Phone and BlackBerry, and you had all sorts of competitors. And I don't know if that was necessarily always considered to be a wonderful time, but it was at least a competitive and thriving, marketplace. And now you have a system where basically the two entities have carved up the market. Apple more or less takes the 30% high margin ground, and Google takes the 70%, rest of it. And that's pretty much how it has been for the past, 5 to 10 years. I do think that competitors need to emerge, and there are, very interesting potential competitors. There's, to even list some more, there's, Sailfish OS, which is interesting. There's a lot of potential, but these are trillion-dollar companies, and to go up against them, I really think you would need sort of a Manhattan Project in order to really create and promote it. And there is one in China. It's called Harmony OS, and they are, forging forward with it. Unfortunately, it's just as locked down as those other platforms, and I doubt it's going to be seen as a great liberator for the world. But they do provide an example of how, with enough will and state sponsorship, you can essentially forced through a, third option, which is, at least in China, I think is going to be an emerging competitor.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's the end of all my questions. The last thing I just wanted to say this. It's not a question, it's just a statement. But this is something I've heard, ever since I started using F-Droid and Android, way back in like 2017, 2018. It's been forever now. But anytime I pick up an iPhone, or I'm using an iPhone for work because I have to use different devices for different things, and I hear this from other people I know who have also gotten used to F-Droid, they say they love their iPhones, but the only thing that's missing is F-Droid. And yeah, so that's kind of high praise that I think that I feel and a lot of people feel in my life. And I see it in our community all the time because there is no really open source ecosystem on the iOS side of things like there is on the Android side of things. So I just wanted to share a lot of appreciation that I have for you guys.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. It really is. We do this for the users, right? We're not getting paid. There's no money going through the project. It's really a labor of love. And really comes from a belief that, when you bought a smartphone, you own it. It's your computer, and you should be allowed to put whatever you want on it. It's just like any other, owning anything else. And to be able to, act as a counterweight to the forces that are trying to make you think otherwise, that, are trying to assert that they actually own your device and they are able to reach down into it and do whatever they want. But yeah, really, it's for the end users, and there are not that many other voices out there that are so purely oriented towards the consumer side of the marketplace. So yeah, so hearing that, always puts a tickle in my heart.
Yeah, so I mean, do you have any thing else that you want to share with people before we log off? And how can people keep up with what's going on in a clean way? And then also, if they want to follow you or F-Droid, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, definitely. So, number one, I would say visit, the F-Droid website, follow the blog. We have RSS feeds and of course social media, primarily on Mastodon. That's a great way to just sort of get in touch with the community. Obviously, installing F-Droid is a great thing to do if you have an Android phone. Look around and see if there's anything interesting. You're not, it's not exclusive to other app stores, so you can have it side by side with Google Play or the Samsung App Store or anything like that. That really helps, because the more people that are aware of it, the more they spread the word, the more we can sort of, fight back against some of these policies. So yeah, so that'd be the main thing. And then the other thing that you might want to consider is visiting, keepandroidopen.org. That has, a variety of sort of concrete action items that people can take, and that will be updated with information about, sort of the progress of this movement as time evolves. But I am actually optimistic. I think, as I said, overwhelming response, universal response in support of, keeping this platform open. I think people are becoming more aware of why it's important. And so I have a good feeling that I think we'll have a good outcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, Mark. I super appreciate it. And definitely go check out the links. I'll leave them down in the show notes for all of you. And I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. It was great chatting.
And that is Marc, everybody. I really liked this interview, and I left feeling really inspired, and I hope that you all felt the same way. If you want to take action, please go in the description and check out the sources that we have down there so that you can also help in the fight. And if you aren't going to do any of that, I at least hope that you all left this a bit more educated on the systems that kind of make up what your phone actually allows you to do. If you enjoy Techlore Talks, it wouldn't be possible without our Techlorians, who get access to exclusive perks and communities, and also make it so that we can do this podcast free for the world and keep it growing so that it reaches more and more people. So check out how you can support us down below, and I'll see you all next time on Techlore Talks.